sounds good. Yeah, so let's start with our session. So hi everyone, hope you're having a great time with the meeting. My name is Magali Nemi. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the Global Institute for Water Security, and I'm one of the organizers of the Advancing Forest Hydrology session, along with Jason Leach and Sheena Spencer. And we're happy to have you here today. Thanks for all your submissions. And as our volunteer remind us, this session is being recorded, and we have two invited speakers to our session. And I'll first introduce you to our first speaker, and not eat too much time of her talk. So we're pleased to have here with us and Audrey Mahieu. She's a professor in the Department of Natural Science at the University of Quebec, or Université du Québec, pardon my French. And she's also the scientific director of the Institute of Temperate Forest Science. Her research is in eco-hydrology and aims to improve our understanding of heat and water fluxes in temperate forests to inform the management of water resources and forest ecosystems in the context of global change. So please, Audrey, if you can share your screen, and we're pleased to hear your talk, and I'll give you the warning. Oh, you're muted.
Thank you. That's better. All right. Well, I was saying that I'm very happy to be here today to be talking about some of the work my lab has been doing in the recent past. And my talk today will be about the impacts of climate change on soil water stress in temperate forests of Eastern North America. And so most of my lab's work is done in temperate forests, so deciduous forests in southern Quebec. This is what these forests look like. Deciduous trees, sugar maple is a dominant tree in these forests, although they're highly diverse. As you go further up north, conifers become more and more important, for example, fir. And so in these forests, with climate change, we expect warmer air temperatures during the growing season. And growing season here refers to the period from May to October. So during that period, we expect warmer air temperatures, a drier atmosphere, so up to a 30% increase in the vapor pressure deficit. And combined with that, we also expect to have slightly wetter conditions. So an increase in precipitation during the growing season. However, these precipitation will be concentrated into fewer large events. So we're also expecting an increase in the number of dry days, so days without precipitation during the growing season. So with all these projected changes, we can ask ourselves, what will be the impact on the forest water balance? So we'll have a change in the input of water, so a slight increase in precipitation, although given these will be larger events, we could expect an increase in runoff and recharge. At the other end, we also expect an increase in the outgoing fluxes of water, and so an increase in evapotranspiration, given a drier atmosphere and warmer air temperatures. And so mostly we'll expect an increase in transpiration, because in these forests, transpiration is the main component of evapotranspiration. And so changes in incoming and outgoing water fluxes, we asked ourselves, well, what will be the impact on soil moisture? And we asked this question in the lens of a tree, because we wanted to know how water availability will change for trees and vegetation in these forests. So to get a better sense of the impacts of climate change on soil water availability for vegetation, we use a modeling approach. And this was Cybelle Cholet's work during her postdoc in my lab. And she used the Canadian land surface sheen, so the class model, to simulate soil water content. So she did that for the current climate using reanalysis data. And she also looked at changes using simulation from the regional climate model. And so feeding those climate data into the model class that will simulate the incoming and outgoing water fluxes, she obtained time series of soil water content, which we then converted into time series of soil water potential. And so I'll be talking a lot about soil water potential, and here I'm using units in hectopascal. And the reason we chose to do this conversion is that soil water potential gives a good representation of the amount of work that is required from vegetation to extract the water from soil. Just a reminder of soil water potential, the range of values that we can expect. And so a value of 0 means you have a saturated soil, while a value of 15,000 hectopascal means you've reached the vegetation wilting point. And so in my presentation, I'll be referring to moderate stress conditions, which we've defined as 9,000 hectopascal. So we now have, using class, we obtained in the end these time series of soil water potential values. And to summarize these time series, we computed 2 indices. So first we looked at the severity of soil water stress, which we've defined as the 95th percentile of soil water potential. And we also looked at the duration of moderate stress condition, which was the mean number of days per year where soil water potential was equal or greater to 9,000 HPA. So that was for the current climate. When we look at the future climate, we looked at projected changes in the severity and the duration of soil water stress, and we compared the 2080s with a reference period defined as 1981 to 2000. So here are some of the results from that work. So here I'm showing the region that you're seeing is called the Outaouais region. It's in southern Quebec. And so it's the temperate forest that I've shown pictures at the beginning. And here we can see that under the current climate, these forests are already experiencing some kind of soil water stress. So on your left, you have the severity of soil water stress, usually light to moderate stress, although certain regions are already experiencing severe water stress. In terms of duration of soil water stress, on average, we see that the region is experiencing about 5 days of moderate stress per year, although again, certain areas are experiencing more than 25 days of moderate stress per year. So this is what we have under the current climate. When we look at the future climate, so here I'm showing the worst case scenario. So under RCP 8.5 for the 2080 horizon. And so on the left, you have changes in severity, and we see on average a 30% increase in the severity of soil water stress. And on your right, you see changes in duration, where we see on average 150% increase in duration. And beyond those numbers, what's really interesting here is what we see that the increase in severity, the largest increases in severity will occur in the northern part of the region, of our study region, while the largest increases in duration of soil water stress will occur in the southern portion of our study region. So if we look at these results into a bit more detail, so here I'm showing a histogram of the duration of the number of days where we see moderate water stress under the current climate. And so what we see here is that about 60% of our study area is currently experiencing less than 5 days of moderate stress level. Less than 5 days of moderate stress. So this is what we have right now. Now, for each bar of that histogram, we've looked at how these areas will change in the future. So for example, for this bar, which represents less than 5 days of moderate water stress, we see that we have a relatively small change in the duration, in the future duration of saltwater stress. And here, when I say small change, I mean relative to what we see across the study area. And so we see this small change in the duration of saltwater stress, but we see the largest increase in the severity of saltwater stress for these areas. At the other end of the histogram, so in summary, we see, so to summarize this portion, we see that the largest increase in severity will occur in areas that are currently experiencing short periods of saltwater stress. So what that means is that the largest increase in severity will occur in forests that do not rarely experience saltwater stress and are probably poorly adapted to saltwater stress conditions. Now, if we take a look at the other end of this histogram, we can see that in areas that are already experiencing extended periods of moderate stress, we'll see a large increase in the duration of water stress, although the severity, we see little to no changes in the severity of saltwater stress for these areas. And so the largest increase in duration will occur in areas already experiencing extended periods of saltwater stress. And so overall, what we see is that we see a projected increase in both the severity and the duration of saltwater stress, but these will occur in different places. And so what that means is that we need to disentangle the impacts associated with an increase in severity of saltwater stress versus the increase in the duration of saltwater stress, which has rarely been done. Usually we tend to study large, long, and severe water stress events. So usually we don't look at these two components of saltwater stress in separate ways. So something to look into in the future. So when we simulated these saltwater stress levels, we observed a considerable spatial variability in the saltwater stress levels across our study area. So we were curious to figure out what drives the spatial variability that we were seeing. And so to do that, we used a random forest model to predict the severity and the duration of saltwater stress, which we had simulated with class. And we looked at the predictor variable importance of various predictor variables to identify which were the main controls of the duration and severity of saltwater stress. And what we found out is that both in the current climate and in the projected change, soil depth was a really important control of the severity and the duration of saltwater stress we were simulating with class. So this result is obviously tied to our model choice. So because we use class, obviously the sensitivity of class to certain variables will influence the results that we're seeing. And the other variables that were, the other variable that was influencing severity and the duration of saltwater stress was soil texture. So overall, we found that soil properties were really important when we simulate saltwater stress, as they explain a large portion of the spatial variability we were simulating the class. So basically, it's really important to get your soil properties right if you want to simulate saltwater stress levels with this model. We were also curious to see how vegetation density influenced saltwater stress levels we were simulating. So to look at that question, we looked at the annual maximum leaf area index, so the annual maximum LAI, across our study area. And here we found out that it varied between 5.7 and 6.7. So we had pretty dense forests that had reached equilibrium. And so to figure out how density influenced soil moisture levels, we did the sensitivity analysis, and we simulated the soil water content for forest stands that had a density leaf area index varying between 4 and 7.5. So that's what you see on the x-axis here. And we saw very little change in soil moisture levels that we were simulating with class, so less than 2%. So what that means is that in this case, forest density was not an important driver of the spatial variability of soil water levels in our study area, given we had dense forests near equilibrium. So if we had much sparser forests, we might have seen something different. But here it seems that once you've reached a certain density, we had little influence on soil moisture levels that were being simulated with class. And so up to now, I've been presenting mostly results from modeling studies. So this is one of the ways that we've looked at these questions of soil water stress levels. But we also use empirical studies to look at these questions. And one of those questions was, can microtopography or another variable offer a hydrologic refugia to vegetation against drought? So for example, our hypothesis here was that in pits, there would be more soil moisture available to trees, and that could offer some kind of refugia against drought. So to study this question, this was Florence Stock's master's work. She measured soil moisture levels as well as fine root density and fine root production in pits and in mounds in these temperate forests. And what she found was that on mounds, so on top of those little mounds, the trees there were growing in drier soils. So the soil moisture levels were always drier. So that's not a very big surprise. So given what we know about the influence of topography on water flow through the soil. But then we also found that trees on these mounds had more extensive root systems. So greater root density, greater fine root density, I should say, and a greater fine root production. So here, what we see is that these microtopography will likely influence the response of these trees to drought, although we're not sure how. And that was probably a question to answer with further work. And so we don't know how, because these trees on top of mounds experience drier conditions, but then perhaps their more extensive root systems help them get access to more water resources, and perhaps they respond a little bit better than trees in pits, which have more water, but then a smaller, less extensive root. So what we concluded from that work is that we needed to improve the representation of land surface conditions in models if we want to use models to identify the location of potential hydrologic refugia. Because right now, microtopography, for example, is certainly not simulated in models like class, for example. And so we need to consider these variables if we want to use models to identify hydrologic refugia. All right, so the next line of work in my lab that we've been doing is, well, now that we know that forests will be facing increasing levels of soil water stress, how do we manage these forests? And so one of the typical approaches is to perform thinning treatments. So thinning is when you reduce the density of your forest. And the idea is that by reducing the density of your forest, you reduce the competition for water resources, and more water resources are available for the trees that are left. And so here, this is Thibault's master's work, and he looked at plots that had 3 levels of thinning intensity. So he looked at a heavily thinned plot with a basal area of 6.5 square meter per hectare, and then a moderately thin stands, and then heavily, lightly thin stands that had a basal area of 20 square meter per hectare. And these various treatments, he measured tree transpiration using Granier sensors that measure the subflux density in trees. And what he found was very surprising to us. So our hypothesis was that in heavily thinned stands, there would be more water resources available to trees and they would transpire more. But we found the complete opposite. And so in here in this graph, we see on the y-axis transpiration rates, and on the x-axis, we see the vapor pressure deficit. So here in relatively dry conditions, so high values of VPD, we see that the largest transpiration rates in blue here occurred in the stands that were relatively dense. So, and we see that the smallest rates of transpiration occur in stands that were heavily thinned. So tree transpiration was greater in dense forests, and that was especially true during dry conditions. So, like I said, we were very surprised by these results, and that made us think that perhaps more work is needed to be able to make recommendation regarding the optimal thinning levels that we need in these forests to increase access to water resources, for example, during drought. Clearly, something's going on, but we're not exactly sure at this point. And at last, I just want to mention some of the work that we are currently doing in my lab. And so because we're so interested in these periods of drought, we've decided to simulate droughts in a forest near a Bayer Institute. And to do that, we install all these tarps and ropes to create a rainfall exclusion. And so that's what we're doing right now. And we're going to measure how these rainfall exclusion will influence sap flow, so the transpiration of trees for different species and in stands with different characteristics. So this is ongoing work that will, and results will be coming through in the next few years. But we've become specialists in installing ropes and tarps, really a great team that has been doing some hard work there. So in conclusion, at the beginning of my talk, the main question that I was addressing was how will climate change impact soil moisture availability in these temperate forests? And I've showed that soil water stress duration will increase at sites that are currently stressed, while soil water stress severity will increase at sites that are currently little stressed and perhaps poorly adapted to soil water stress. Then I talked a little bit about what drives the spatial variability of soil moisture in forests. And I've shown that soil depth and texture were important drivers of soil water stress levels we were simulating the class, but vegetation density had little effect in these relatively dense forests near equilibrium. I've talked a little bit about the influence of microtopography on soil moisture levels. And here our main conclusion was that we need to improve the representation of landscape condition and models if we want to be able to use them to identify the location of potential hydrologic refuge. And last, facing these impacts from climate change, how do we manage forests? And here I've shown surprising results where transpiration increased with tree density, especially during dry conditions. Which we concluded that more work was needed to be able to make recommendations regarding optimal thinning. And so, so with that, I'd like to thank all the hard work of people from my lab, past and present, and thanks to funders as well, and I'll answer any questions.
Yeah, thank you very much, Audrey. I'd like to open the floor for questions. Is there anyone in the audience that would like to ask any question? Or you can unmute yourself or type the question in.
So there's a question in the chat.
Yeah.
Perhaps I can answer that one to get things started. So Jason asks, any guesses why trees in the dense forest transpired more than thin forests during dry conditions? Well, yeah, that's a hard one. We think, but we did not measure it. We think that in some of the thinning treatments were pretty intense. So we reduced the forest density to 6.5 square meters per hectare, which is like a really heavily thin stand. And we think that perhaps evaporation was really important in these forests. And so we would expect an increase in water resources available to trees, but if soil evaporation was really important, then that was perhaps not the case. So that's our hypothesis, but we don't have a clear answer to that.
Yeah, there's another question there. I can read. How robust do you think is the signal of soil water stress duration / severity you get from the RCM simulations? Is there a physical explanation for this trend? Is it coming from a single simulation or an ensemble?
All right, great question. I ran through pretty quickly on those details, but we use an ensemble of 4 simulations simulation from 4 models for the RCP 4.5 and 4 models for the RCP 8.5. And what I've showed was the ensemble mean. So given that and with that in mind, I think the signal is pretty robust in what we see. And the physical explanation here is mostly an increase in evapotranspiration. So this is what's driving the lower soil moisture levels that we're simulating. It's mostly the increase in evapotranspiration, and it overcomes the slight increase in precipitation. So even though we have the slight increase in precipitation, there's so much more evapotranspiration that soil moisture levels are really dropping significantly.
Is there any other question there? I would also encourage people to unmute themselves if they feel like it, and we can make this more dynamic as well. Another question here. Thanks for your excellent presentation. How did you bias correct the climate scenarios? Which hydrological model did you use for the simulations? Which hydrological model?
And so we did not bias correct climate scenarios because we only showed relative changes. So we used the delta method where we only look at the relative change between the 2080 period and a reference period. So, and the reason what we had to do that is because we didn't bias correct all of the input data that's needed to class, because that would have been a lot of bias correction. We wanted to do that, but we ran out of time. And the model that we use is class. So it's a land surface model that we've used.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, if there is any other last question, I think we can take that. If not, I think we'll move on to our next speaker.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much, Aldo. Thanks for your time for your presentation. Yeah, so our next speaker here is Jesse Ham, and he's also an invited speaker. Jesse has some issues with the internet, so we pre-recorded the video, and he's also here to answer questions in the end. I'll just give you a brief introduction. Jesse is an assistant professor in the Department of Geography at Simon Fraser University, and he studies how the subsurface mediates water availability to plant communities and streams in the context of climate change. And thank you very much, Jesse, for being here today and for recording your talk. So I'll let Jason play the pre-recorded version.
Hello, my name is Jesse Ham, and I'm a faculty member in the Department of Geography at Simon Fraser University. Thank you very much to the conveners for organizing this session and hosting it. This work today was made possible by numerous collaborators, and I would also like to thank many funding agencies who enabled the work to proceed. We know that globally, about 2 billion people rely on water from mountainous areas. And even when that water is not in the form of snowmelt, high elevation areas and upland areas have disproportionate amounts of rainfall, and that rainfall provides water to runoff in lowland areas where populations are concentrated. We also know that forests cover about 40% of Canada. They're widespread, and in Western Canada, many of our forests are concentrated in upland landscapes. These types of landscapes, however, are changing. The particulars vary depending on the location, but in addition to warming in the west coast of North America, our best projections tell us that precipitation is becoming more volatile. That is, extremely wet seasons and extremely dry seasons are both expected to occur more frequently. In addition to greater year-to-year variability, southern BC is expected to have greater precipitation seasonality, becoming more Mediterranean, and due to warming, the snowpack will give way to rain. With all of this volatility, especially drought, forests have been dying. There's been a lot of work to determine the causal drivers of why some forests die while others survive. One of the themes that's emerged from this work is that predicting or explaining the biogeography of tree mortality, that is, the spatial distribution of where trees died, from plant physiological factors alone doesn't work so well. Why is predicting mortality so hard? Well, a key variable is water storage below ground. And this is really, really important in seasonally dry climates where energy and precipitation are 6 months out of phase. In summer, evapotranspiration exceeds precipitation, meaning that the plants rely on stored water from previous seasons for growth when sunlight is available in the summer. Whether or not this meteorological drought becomes plant mortality is really a subsurface question. And that's because plants don't really care how much it rains per se, they care about how much water is stored in the root zone. In the winter wet, summer dry West Coast climate, trees dig deep for water, typically way beyond the thin upland soils where sensors sometimes exist, into the weathered bedrock, fractured bedrock beneath, where plant available water can be stored in the unsaturated zone as rock moisture or as seasonal groundwater deeper down. And I invite you throughout this talk to think about slicing open a hill slope and observing what these different layers, what you would see inside of a hill slope and cross-section profile. A key parameter for understanding how trees experience drought is the root zone water storage capacity, or how much total volume plant available water is available to them. This storage capacity includes water in both the soil and in the underlying weathered bedrock. And unfortunately, it's really fairly difficult to observe this in situ. Our efforts require deep, expensive drilling and time laborious geophysical tools and instruments. And so in general, very little data exists. So how are we able to move beyond our little postage stamp hill slope scale field study sites to estimate this water storage property at larger spatial scales? And what can it tell us about drought resilience? The approach that we've taken to this is to use remotely sensed precipitation and evapotranspiration data sets to track the subsurface water storage deficit. And the deficit is just a measure of how dry the subsurface is, represented here with the sponge. You can think of the deficit as you think of an account balance. ET is a withdrawal in green on top, and precipitation is a deposit in blue in middle. The deficit is in orange on the bottom, the amount of debt, basically. And whenever ET exceeds precipitation over time, the deficit grows, and vice versa. If precipitation is larger than ET, it will shrink. And we can think about the biggest amount owed over time, the biggest deficit that we observe, as a lower bound on the size of the storage capacity in the subsurface. And so these observations can tell us how big the storage bucket has to be to explain the observed evapotranspiration that we've seen over time. When we've done this across the United States and we think about the storage capacity as the combination of bedrock and soil storage capacity, if we subtract away the soil capacity from existing maps from our inferred total capacity with this method, we can estimate the size of the bedrock bucket. And these findings are particularly striking in California, where a lot of the mortality has been observed. We see there that in upland forested parts of the state, the trees are relying on bedrock water storage every single year, as indicated in green on the map. And we've also found that in California, the amount of water stored in bedrock and used by plants exceeds that of the soil. And a fun statistic is that the size of the plant access storage capacity in bedrock actually exceeds the typical storage in all of the state's dammed reservoirs combined. So this gave us insight into just how widespread our field observations of rooting into bedrock are across the West. And what we've found is that this behavior is routine and not just some kind of ecological rarity. The storage-based way of thinking can help explain some of the observed mysteries of tree mortality. And for example, in the most recent drought, despite receiving about half of the average annual precipitation in the Northern California coast ranges, very little mortality was actually observed. We'd been quantifying tree water stress and water availability using pre-dawn water potential, a measure of how hard the tree has to pull to get water from the dry subsurface at 2 different sites in the coast ranges, one in oak savanna and the other an evergreen forest. And what we saw was generally consistent with the lack of observed mortality. Yes, plant water stress was different between the 2 sites, but really importantly, it was not different between years with more than 2-fold difference in total precipitation, a record drought and a record total wet year. So not only did the trees not die in drought, we observed that they didn't really seem to know that the drought had even occurred. How can this be the case? Well, at the evergreen forested site, about a decade of down borehole neutron probe measurements have been used to quantify seasonal storage in the weathered bedrock, shown here on the y-axis. The key observation is that when the first rains come in the fall, we see that storage increasing with cumulative precipitation, but after a certain point, we see it plateau. It keeps raining, but you don't get more seasonal water storage. The rest is obviously going to stream flow. And this is an example of what we would call seasonal water storage limitation. The subsurface sponge is much smaller than the amount of water that's coming in from above, and so it can't store everything, and it can essentially become decoupled from the total amount of precipitation in any given year. So we wondered whether this hill slope scale observation could observe the resilience that we were seeing at the catchment scale and across the landscape. And we quantified seasonal dynamic water storage across many different years on the y-axis as a function of precipitation. At this site, the 2 are uncorrelated. We hypothesized that in such places, we would see forest productivity at the bottom also be decoupled from the total amount of annual precipitation, even though there's very large differences between different years. And that is indeed what we saw. No correlation, decoupling at this storage capacity limited site where little mortality was observed. We did this for many different catchments across the state, and we observed a spectrum of behaviors. Without exception, in places where storage is insensitive to precipitation, the plant community also seems to be insensitive to very large variations in precipitation. Conversely, in places where storage is closely coupled to the total amount of precipitation, we saw that the various metrics of plant productivity were also closely coupled. We had observed what was going on below ground at this storage capacity limited style site, but we hadn't had direct observations inside of the hill slope at these precipitation limited sites. This motivated the development of a new field site in a drier part of the Northern California Coast Range, where some of our initial drilling observations and climate records suggested that conditions could be ripe for these precipitation limited conditions. And at this site, it's also worth pointing out that there's a deep weathered bedrock profile, and we have observed roots down to 8 meters below the surface. So the trees are down there, and we have a thick sponge, potentially able to store a lot of water. It didn't take long for us to observe precipitation volatility. In the first few years of monitoring, we had a very wet year, followed by 2 record dry years. And in those dry years, we also observed that there was no stream flow at the site. When we monitored what was going on below ground, we saw that the rain was sufficient to replenish water stored in the soils, which are between 40 and 100 centimeters thick. So if you were just measuring the soils, you'd think that everything was just fine. However, we were also monitoring deeper unsaturated weathered bedrock water storage, and we observed that that was not fully replenished. So the bottom row here is a snapshot of water content data in one borehole at the site through time. And if we integrate this integrate this change in water storage across all the boreholes, we get a change in water content in the subsurface across the whole site. And what we saw is as the drought progressed, the subsurface got drier and drier, and the rains were not sufficient to replenish that water storage. When we looked at the trees, in the first year of drought, it appears as though everything was okay. The sap flow was a bit decreased, but then in the second drought, we tended to see that the trees did not leaf out, and we saw widespread crown dieback. And we're continuing to monitor this site to try to better understand what's going on. Most of these oaks are more than 100 years old, and their loss would be very devastating in this landscape. We think that the deficit-based framework is not only useful for a post-mortem style analysis, trying to understand what happened in the past, but can also be used to better predict where future precipitation patterns may be insufficient or too volatile to reliably replenish the below ground water storage. And we think that this can help us identify the vulnerability of forest by using various future climate scenarios. So thank you very much. I'll just end with these take-home points. This root zone water storage deficit is a powerful framework for understanding and predicting the response of upland forested landscapes to drought. Both soil and bedrock water storage tend to be required to explain the observed magnitudes of deficits. And most of what we're missing in our equation, we think, is this deeper subsurface, and we need to look inside of these hill slopes to try to better understand what's going on. So thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Jesse, for your talk. Yeah, I'll open the floor for questions. People have questions.
Hi, Jesse. Thanks. The talk was really interesting. I have an amateur question. I don't really know much about the field, but I was curious to know, since that underground water storage seems to be really important, do you distinguish between kind of more extreme precipitation events versus kind of more normal precipitation events? Is there more water getting where it needs to be, more in the extreme or more in the normal precipitation types? Or is it kind of irrelevant?
That's a really great question. And I would say that we don't totally know yet. But what I would say is that at these field sites that we've been observing, overland flow is extremely rare. And so even in the most intense precipitation that we've observed, all of the water does infiltrate into the ground surface. And we think that it must transit through the vadose zone before recharging seasonal groundwater to produce stream flow. So it's hard to find a shortcut. But if it were the case that we're missing places that experience Hortonian or infiltration excess overland flow, it's possible that a change in the magnitude frequency distribution of precipitation would alter how much water is actually getting into the hill slope for sure.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Is there another question?
I'll ask a quick question there if we've got some time. Great presentation, Jesse. Really enjoyed it. I guess I was just curious, then in the one graph you're sort of showing us some sort of measure of forest productivity. Could you just speak a little bit to what that measure is and what assumptions or uncertainties might go into that? But otherwise, yeah, fantastic.
That one was a very qualitative relabeling of a plot axis that behind the scenes is a normalized EVI, the Enhanced Vegetation Index, which is a satellite metric of greenness. But the observations are consistent depending on whichever satellite metric you want to use, and including some of the derived evapotranspiration metrics. But if other people have suggestions for ideal ways to detect stress remotely, I would be very keen to hear about them.
Yeah, thank you. We have one time still for questions, and if there is no questions from the chat or the audience, I would ask one myself. So there is a lot of, you show the importance of monitoring subsurface water storage in unsaturated bedrock. You have done that a lot in the field. So what do you suggest to be like people here when I start doing that and monitoring subsurface storage? What method would you recommend in the field?
So drilling, I think, is important to access this. sensor-wise, there are versions of time domain reflectometers that you can kind of smush against a borehole, but it's tricky to interpret them. It's not like you're sticking the probes into a soil matrix. So it's hard to get real-time continuous observations. We have found that the neutron probe is like the gold standard, most accurate way to measure changes in unsaturated zone moisture in bedrock, but it's regulatorily challenging to have a radiation source, and you have to physically go and make these measurements every month or so. And so I wish I had a better answer for you for how to monitor this in the field, but I don't.
No, that's great. Yeah, that's great. Thank you very much. We have to move on. We're at 1:40 Saskatoon time, and it's time for Suzanne, which you will hear from his poster. So now we have a 10-minute time slot for a poster discussion.
Can you see my poster?
Yes, we can see your poster.
Okay. So hi everyone. I'm Susan, and my poster title is Quantifying Evapotranspiration in Seasonally Frozen Forest. My supervisor was Andrew Ryerson during my master's. So yeah, the accurately quantifying evapotranspiration in a region is important for water management and energy balance assessment. A better understanding of ET can improve our resilience to diverse and increasing threats to water security around the globe. In northern latitudes, hydrological processes are highly dynamic in the spring. Our ability to quantify ET during this period is still limited. So this study focuses on improving our understanding of ET simulation during the melt period in seasonally frozen soils. So my study site is the berm. So that is, I have 3 sites. This is old aspen, old black spruce, and old jack pine. So these 2 are coniferous, old black spruce and old jack pine, and this is the deciduous forest. And the ET measurements for the sites was half hourly, and there are scaffold towers installed at all 3 sites. So for my study, I used a Canadian land surface scheme, and the model was run from 1997 to 2017, and the OBS and OA had old black spruce and old aspen had an organic soil layer configuration, and old jack pine had a mineral soil layer configuration. So what we have here is a figure that shows the Canadian land surface scheme simulation of ET. So the green period is the melt period, which starts from March to June 1. And the blue line here represents the simulated ET, which is higher than the observed ET represented by this orange line. So we can see that ET is overestimated during the melt period. So the red component is the transpiration, which makes up for the bulk of the total evapotranspiration during this period, meaning that it is transpiration that is overestimated. So next, here we have a model evaluation. So in the standard configuration, like we said earlier, it has 3 soil layers. Here we are just looking at layer 1, the top surface layer. And there is no liquid water when the soil temperature here is less than 0, which means there is no representation of freezing point depression. The other thing to note here is transpiration is turned off in the model when the soil temperature is less than 0 degrees Celsius. So if freezing point depression were included in the model, the soil temperature would drop below 0 degrees Celsius during the phase transition we see in the spring. And we can also see that transpiration is dependent on the remaining liquid water content during the freezing. So transpiration is expected to be occurring below 0 degrees Celsius. So it can be speculated. So we hypothesize that transpiration should not occur at soil temperature below 0 degrees Celsius, even if the liquid water is there in the supercooled state in the soil pores. So here, what you are seeing is a lot of like the black line is the one where transpiration is equal to 0 degree. This is a cumulative transpiration, and this blue line is when temperature of that particular soil there is greater than 0, and this black line represents when temperature is equal to 0 for soil, and this red line is transpiration when it's less than 0. So you can see that a lot of transpiration is happening when the temperature is equal to 0. So subtracting transpiration when temperature is equal to 0 improve the simulation during the melt period. Therefore, we made 2 suggestions, including a freezing point depression in the model, and also including a water stress function to shut down transpiration when soil temperature is less than 0 degrees Celsius. So these 2 modifications, as you can see here, improved. We didn't include a freezing point depression, but just the second function we did it. And you can see the modified version is a lot closer to the observed ET. So you need to have one thing in mind, that we didn't do any field studies. So I think the next step would be to conduct field studies and maybe understand how the root system works as we transition from winter to spring. So I guess that's it. If you have any questions or suggestions, I would appreciate it.
Thank you very much. That's very interesting. I'll open the floor to questions as well. People feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question, or type in the question.
Suzanne, I'll jump in here for a second. Great poster, and thanks a lot for the presentation. Really interesting stuff. I guess my question, following on your last point, if you had to go out and design a study to sort of test this stuff in the field, what would you be looking for, and what would you want to sort of really try to nail down in this case?
I think one of the thing I would be interested is how when the sap flow occurs at the 3 forest sites. I think that would be something I think interesting to look at. And even this one of the other thing is the root system is not dynamic in class. So maybe understand like how the root system works as we transition from fall to winter, and even from like winter to spring. I think those are the 2 things I would be interesting in knowing.
Yeah, very interesting. I have, if someone has another question, please chime in and type in. But I just have one comment. I've worked at the sites as well, and it's very interesting you looking from the modeling perspective. At those sites, I've seen the rehydration phase as an important step as well, because the trees start to rehydrate the stem prior to the onset of transpiration. So this could be something interesting to look at, and I have done, so we could further chat about it.
Sure, that'd be good.
Yeah,
Thank you.
it looks very, very interesting. First time I see your work. Yeah, looks very interesting.
Thank you.
Yeah, we have time for a question or 2, but otherwise I can also move on with the schedule. But thank you very much, Suzanne. It was, yeah, nice posting.
Thanks.
Yeah, I will. So our next speaker is Hydrographs. If you are there, we can start sharing your screen and presentation.
Can you see my screen?
Yeah, it's just not on presentation mode yet. Yeah.
Okay, there we go.
Yeah.
Okay, hello everyone. My name is Harvinder Sidhu, and I'm a recent graduate from McMaster University in Hamilton, Ontario. And today I'm going to be talking about my undergraduate thesis, which investigates the effects of spruce budworm defoliation on catchment hydrology in hilly spruce and fir-dominated forests in Gaspé, Quebec. So over the last few decades, it has become clear that Canada's boreal forest has been subject to a variety of natural and anthropogenic disturbances, ranging from wildfire to harvesting. However, one disturbance that is not always talked about is the impacts of forest pests. Specifically, the eastern spruce budworm, which is a moth native to North America that feeds on spruce and fir trees, is one of the most destructive pests to the Canadian boreal forest. And although it seems like a harmless caterpillar, the eastern spruce budworm has been responsible for the large-scale defoliation of conifer forests in eastern Canada for centuries, and has often caused large reductions in forest density and increased tree mortality and growth loss. Now, this raises the question, how do such large-scale disturbances to our terrestrial landscape and forest canopy affect critical processes across an ecosystem, such as those in the hydrological cycle? Well, it's important to recognize that a forest canopy plays a critical role in a catchment's water balance by regulating a range of hydrological processes and fluxes both at the surface and subsurface level. Some of these processes can include evapotranspiration, throughfall, infiltration, storage, groundwater flow, and surface runoff, all of which have the potential to affect nearby stream ecosystems. However, in the past, we have seen that disturbances that result in the removal of a forest canopy can often modify the rate and magnitude at which these hydrological processes and fluxes occur. In the case of a defoliated catchment, we can therefore expect that there may be reductions in evapotranspiration or even increases in throughfall, storage, groundwater flow, and runoff. Now, although there are numerous studies that have investigated the effects of other disturbances such as forestry or fire on catchment hydrology, the impacts of insect defoliation on runoff and streamflow processes are still poorly understood. So this introduces us to the objective of this study, which is to understand how varying degrees of catchment defoliation by the spruce budworm affect streamflow processes in defoliated catchments. And we'll be looking at stream discharge specifically. So to address this knowledge gap, we investigated 12 catchments across the Gaspé Peninsula in eastern Quebec over a 2-year period between 2019 and 2020. The Gaspé Peninsula has undergone episodic spruce budworm outbreaks for centuries, with the most recent outbreak starting in 2016. Defoliation typically varies year to year. And so on the right-hand side, we could see a map of a snapshot of the 2020 defoliation values, where U, C, and L represent the upper, central, and lower catchments respectively. So these catchments make up part of the Chick-Chalk Mountain Range and increase in elevation from the south side of the peninsula to the north. And the mean catchment elevations typically range from 200 to 800 meters, and they could be divided into 3 upper catchments, 4 central catchments, and 5 lower catchments. And in 2020, half of these catchments were aerially sprayed with BTK pesticide, which allowed them to defoliate to varying degrees, and therefore create a really nice gradient of defoliation across the peninsula. So in 2019 and 2020, stream stage and stream discharge measurements were conducted between June and October in each of the catchments. Stream stage was measured at 15-minute intervals using a pressure transducer, and stream discharge is manually measured every 2 to 3 weeks using the velocity area gauging method. These measurements were then used to derive stage discharge relationships, which helped us produce stream hydrographs for each of the catchments over the 2-year period. As well, we also produced linear regressions, which help determine the relationship between discharge and defoliation intensity, both at the annual and seasonal scale, as well as to illustrate the effects of various catchment characteristics, such as forest composition or catchment area and slope, on the defoliation and discharge patterns across the peninsula. And as for defoliation, a standardized provincial defoliation metric was used, which essentially represents the distance-weighted effects of defoliation on a catchment's preferential flow pathways and the stream water body as well. So we first want to understand which catchment characteristics were driving defoliation across the peninsula. So here we have plotted the spruce fir composition as a percentage on the y-axis and mean catchment elevation in meters on the x-axis. And what we can see here is that with increasing catchment elevation, there is a significant increase in spruce fir composition. And then when we take a look at the size of the data points, which is shown here, we can also see that there is an increase in defoliation intensity or mean defoliation intensity with increasing elevation. Here, mean defoliation intensity is on a scale that ranges from 0 to 3, which represents low to severe defoliation respectively. So based on this information, we can then divide the data according to the geographical regions of the catchments, which is shown here by the colors, so by the central, lower, and upper regions. And when we do this, it's clear that the upper and central catchments not only exhibit the highest spruce fir compositions, but they also have the greatest defoliation intensities relative to the lower catchments here, which display a lot more variability. And while we are still considering elevation as a factor, we could then group together the upper and central catchments as they are more representative of a homogeneous spruce fir stand, whereas the lower catchments could be more representative of a mixed or heterogeneous spruce fir stand. So next, we produce stream hydrographs for each of the catchments with total log discharge in meters cubed per day on the y-axis, and then the date on the x-axis between June and October for 2019 and 2020. And here we can see that there are distinct differences in discharge between the central, lower, and upper regions, particularly for the higher elevation catchments, the upper regions, where we can see that there are higher stream discharge rates. As well, between the three regions, we can also see that there are similarities in some of the seasonal trends, such as low flows in the summer and higher flows in the autumn months. Now we're just going to take a look at the linear regression between total log discharge and mean defoliation intensity. I'm just going to draw your attention to the x-axis here. Mean defoliation intensity increases from left to right, which is also shown by the photos at the bottom here, which on the left-hand side, you can see a non-defoliated branch, and on the right-hand side, you can see what a severely defoliated branch looks like. So this graph is for 2019 and 2020 combined, and we can see that there is a pretty strong positive linear relationship between discharge and defoliation intensity. But when we group the data by the geographical regions and club together the upper and central catchments, which is shown in orange, we can once again see that there are these distinct differences in discharge between these different catchment regions. Specifically, the upper and central catchments are exhibiting the strongest relationship between discharge and defoliation intensity. And that's likely due to the abundance of spruce and fir, and therefore increased defoliation intensity at these higher elevations. As well, it's also possible that with increasing elevation, there could have been an increase in total precipitation, which may have contributed to these effects. However, these trends are not as clear for the lower catchments, and that could be due to the variability we saw earlier in the spruce fir composition elevation regression, as the lower catchments may be more representative of a mixed stand. As well, it's also possible that there could be a threshold when mean defoliation intensity is equal to 1.5, which essentially represents moderate defoliation, but we plan on running piecewise linear regression models to determine whether or not there is in fact an inflection point here in the data. So next, we repeated these steps, but at the seasonal scale to see how discharge responded to defoliation between the autumn months in blue and the summer months in orange, and then how that then related to annual discharge. So for both seasons, we can see that there is an increase in discharge with increasing defoliation, particularly for the summer months, which show the strongest relationship between discharge and defoliation intensity. And what this may suggest is that annual discharge is likely to be exacerbated by some of the summer low flows. But just like the trends that we saw with annual discharge, when we clump together the upper and central catchments and separate them from the lower catchments, we can once again see that these higher elevation catchments are exhibiting the strongest relationship between discharge and defoliation intensity. So some of the reasons why we could be seeing some of these differences in the seasonal discharge could be due to snowmelt contributions in the summer months, as well as seasonal differences in precipitation trends and evapotranspiration. which could ultimately affect things like groundwater storage and antecedent moisture levels. So to conclude, after analyzing the 12 catchments in the Gaspé Peninsula, we noticed that there was a significant change in stream discharge with increasing defoliation intensity, particularly in the higher elevation catchments where spruce and fir was more abundant, where precipitation was likely to increase. However, at the seasonal scale, we did observe that the summer months or the summer season exhibited the strongest relationship between discharge and defoliation intensity, which could be due to seasonal differences in precipitation and evapotranspiration. So understanding how streamflow responds to defoliation intensity is significant as it helps us better manage our freshwater resources and understand potential flood risks. It has also been predicted by past studies that future spruce bloodworm outbreaks are likely to increase in frequency, size, and intensity. So understanding these relationships is significant for implementing sustainable forest management practices, especially when we are confronted by compounding disturbances like climate change. So as for next steps, we hope to perform base flow separation and recession limb analyses to better understand the event flow and base flow contributions, as well as to incorporate 2021 defoliation and hydrological data to our study. Now I would like to just acknowledge that this research was conducted on the traditional territory of the Mi'kmaq First Nations, and I would like to thank our collaborators and those who have funded and supported this project. Thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to hearing any of your questions or feedback. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Very great talk. I'll open the floor for discussions and questions. Someone has, you can unmute yourself or type the question.
I'll jump in again. Harvinder, that was a fantastic presentation. Thank you very much. Along that question of the sort of potential precipitation gradients at these sites, could you, is there any like data out there? Did your team sort of happen to collect any precipitation data, or are there existing stations to sort of help sort of maybe tease out that orographic effect that may be going on there? But
yeah, that's definitely an important question to ask. I don't know exactly. Right now, we are exploring new precipitation data or maybe some precipitation data from another weather station. I know that the weather station we used is, we're a bit concerned about how far it is from some of the upper sites particularly. So it is something that we hope to figure out in the future while we still continue to work on this project. But that's something I'll definitely keep in mind, is to check out for a precipitation gradient.
Yeah, great. Thank you. And I have a question myself. Maybe I missed it and it's on me, but when did the defoliation event happen and how long it took to see the effect on the stream flow?
Yeah, so this particular outbreak in the Gaspé region started around 2016. But yeah, my project really is only focused on from 2019 to now 2021. And I don't know what the hydrological data looks like or the stream flow data looks like pre-2019, but we are starting to see that defoliation is getting more severe. So yeah, I wish I had access to that data, but yeah, I can imagine that there is kind of like a slow trend that's of increasing stream flow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that would be interesting. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, is there another question? We have perhaps time for one more question.
I'll ask one. I was curious how long the defoliation effects will propagate forward, for how many years? Is it every, like just 1 year, but you're saying it started in 2016. So how long do you think that this is going to affect your stream flow?
Yeah, typically these outbreaks can occur for, I'd say around like 6 to 10 years, but yeah, I don't know too much about how fast, these forests recover over time. I also know that the Gaspé area has experienced things like harvesting, so I don't know if that also plays as a compounding factor. I can imagine, similar to other disturbances, that there will be a recovery slowly afterwards, but hopefully we can encourage maybe some longer term studies to really understand those long-term effects.
Yeah, that would be great. Thank you.
Yeah,
No worries. Thank
thank
you.
you very much. Thanks for the talk. And I will invite our next speaker, Annie Gray. You can share your screen and share your talk.
Okay. Hello, everyone. My name's Annie Gray, and I'm a graduate student at the University of Waterloo, working under the supervision of Dr. Mike Stone. Apologies, I've just got to get my camera going here. Today, I'll be presenting my research entitled Event Scale Hydrologic Responses in a hardwood-dominated headwater catchment 25 years following clear-cut harvesting. So to begin with some background, it's pretty well documented that forest harvesting practices, for instance, clear cutting, do have an impact on the hydrologic responses of the harvested catchments across a variety of timescales. These changes in turn can impact the export of sediment and nutrients from the landscape to the receiving waters, with some implications for downstream water quality and for drinking water treatment. However, while there's been a lot of work done on the immediate and the short-term hydrologic implications of harvesting, relatively few studies have looked at the long-term implications of clear-cut harvesting, particularly on event-scale hydrology in headwater catchments. This knowledge gap is due in part to the simple fact that many long-term hydrometric and precipitation monitoring programs, they just don't sample at a sufficiently high frequency to capture sub-daily dynamics, such as those we see during short-lived high-flow events. So to help fill in some of the gaps, both in terms of sampling and in terms of knowledge, my study intended to use sub-daily streamflow and precipitation data with the objective of evaluating and contrasting how antecedent moisture conditions and the characteristics of precipitation events could be influencing event-scale hydrologic responses of two neighboring headwater catchments in the Boreal Shield. To this end, my methods addressed three questions. The first being, what are the temporal and spatial patterns in the event-scale relationships between precipitation and streamflow? The second, what factors are influencing the hydrologic responses? And third, under what conditions, if any, do we see the greatest intercatchment differences in event scale hydrologic response? The catchments in question are basins C32 and C31, both located within the Turkey Lakes experimental watershed, which is about 60 kilometers north of Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario. In 1997, C31 was clear-cut harvested as part of the Forest Harvesting Impacts Program, whereas C32 remained relatively undisturbed to act as a control. These two basins are comparable in terms of their size, slope, aspect, geology, and percentage of wetland coverage. Some previous work in Basin C31, that's the clear cut, has shown evidence of harvest-induced flow path changes, particularly in favor of faster near-surface pathways and overall decreased mean travel times. Those changes could impact the magnitude and the timing of event-scale stream responses, again with some implications for nutrient export. That said, the studies completed so far in these catchments haven't focused specifically on the responses of these catchments to sub-daily high-flow storm events. While there has been some recent work in Turkey Lakes watershed on event-scale hydrology, the focus previously was on contrasting lake catchments versus non-lake catchments, rather than a direct comparison between a control and a clear-cut harvest. On top of that, sub-daily precipitation values were not available until recently at Turkey Lakes, and that provides a great opportunity to jump in and examine some sub-daily rainfall runoff dynamics in these contrasting catchments. This study uses 10-minute stream flow and precipitation data from January 2020 to December 2021, which is shown here in daily aggregate form. Total precipitation was 1,097 millimeters in 2020 and 832 millimeters in 2021. Total stream flow in C32, that's the control, was 585 millimeters and 306 millimeters in 2020 and 2021, respectively, with C31, the clear cut, yielding relatively lower total values of 426 and 241 millimeters. So with that data set in mind, the conceptual foundation for this study's analytical methods is that at a very high level, The magnitude and the timing of a given basin's event scale response can be thought of as a function of three main categories. The first is the characteristics and properties inherent to the catchment itself, including its forest harvest history or a lack thereof. The second category is the moisture conditions present in the catchment prior to the start of the event. And the third category is, of course, the characteristics of the precipitation event itself. So based on this conceptual framework, the analytical workflow of this study followed 5 main steps that are shown here. First, I identified storm events based on the 10-minute data using a minimum threshold of 10 millimeters of total precipitation and separating the events by a minimum of 12 hours. Following Mystic and Johnson 2021, I added 24 hours to the end of each of my events, and that's to allow for a return to base flow conditions. From the start time of each event, I calculated metrics of antecedent conditions, in particular 24-hour, 7-day, and 14-day total antecedent precipitation, and for each catchment, 24-hour, 7-day, and 14-day mean antecedent stream flow. Additionally, I calculated the 1-hour pre-event mean flow. That's sort of a catch-all proxy for the conditions in each basin at the start of each event, and that's to account for the fact that metrics such as antecedent precipitation can sometimes be misleading due to things like rainfall interception, which occur at certain times of the year, but not necessarily at others. In terms of event characteristics, I characterized my events using duration, total event precipitation, and the mean and peak precipitation intensity. And then finally, the last step was the catchment response, quantified by a suite of metrics, including total stream flow, runoff ratio, total event quick flow, that's following hydrograph separation, and the time of peak stream flow relative to the time of peak precipitation. Overall, to contrast the catchment responses and to evaluate the controls, I considered both the metrics of antecedent conditions and those of event character to be my predictor variables. In total, I identified 53 events between March and November of each of the 2 years, illustrated here in chronological order by start date. Event precipitation ranged from 10 to 80 millimeters for these events. Of those 53 events, 13 were identified in the spring, meaning March through May, 18 in the summer, meaning June through August, and finally 22 were identified in fall, meaning September through November. So if we think of total event precipitation as our key metric of event character, the graphs here on this slide contrast the relationship between event precipitation and event stream flow between the seasons for each of my study catchments. Note in particular the high correlations in both catchments during the summer and fall, in contrast to the relatively lower regressions occurring in the spring. Those springtime discrepancies are very likely related to snowfall and or rain on snow events, as those do typically occur from late March to early May at Turkey Lakes watershed. The summer and fall correlations are higher in the clear cut relative to the control, but that observation really needs to be placed in the context of the clear cut catchment generally having lower pre-event flows than the control, and in a lot of cases, absolutely no pre-event flow whatsoever. In these graphs, I use mean precipitation intensity as the metric of event character, replacing total precipitation. And here we see again a strong seasonal pattern, but in this case, the strongest correlation is found during the summer in the clear-cut catchment. Once again, events of the same total precipitation or intensity tend to yield relatively higher flows in the spring and relatively lower flows in the fall. And that's a pretty reasonable pattern for these basins, given the known influence of seasonality on the hydrology in C32 and C31. So while these figures do a good job of illustrating the strong seasonal controls on these event scale relationships, what they're leaving out is the influence of subseasonal antecedent moisture conditions. This leads me to my next 2 figures, which sort of reframe the relationship between total event precipitation and stream flow in each catchment with respect to a binary classification of wet or dry antecedent conditions. Wet conditions are shown here by the dark circles and dry by the light. So I made this classification for each catchment modified from von Freiberg et al. 2014. And I used the median value of the 1-hour mean antecedent stream flows observed for each catchment as the threshold between wet and dry. 2 key takeaways from these figures are the many cases of dry antecedent conditions in the clear cut, and an overall observation that events of the same magnitude can yield very different stream flow responses, depending in part on the antecedent conditions. And this is particularly true in the clear cut catchment. Based on the graphs presented here and in the past couple of slides, it's reasonable to infer that both seasonality and subseasonal antecedent conditions are exerting some control over the event scale streamflow responses in both of these catchments. These observations are further supported by some preliminary PLS regression analysis, excuse me, which identified strong positive loadings for variables related first to antecedent conditions, and that included month of occurrence to represent seasonality, and secondly to metrics of event character, with metrics of antecedent moisture conditions subseasonally coming in third. Excuse me. So with the preliminary idea of the main controls on event scale response in each character, I now return to the research question of under which circumstances, if any, do we see the greatest intercatchment differences in our event scale response. The graphs on these slides compare event streamflow for the control on the x-axis to their counterparts in the clear cut on the y. For reference, the dotted lines plot the one-to-one regression relationship. Broken down by season only in the top left, high correlations can be seen between the two catchments across all the seasons, with summer once more giving us our lowest relative correlation. Breaking down the data a bit further into classes of both season and antecedent moisture conditions in the bottom right, we see high positive correlations between the catchments in the spring and fall. In contrast, the summer events yielded the lowest correlations relative to the other seasons, with wet antecedent conditions showing greater discrepancy than dry. That, however, is based on a very small number of events over a very small precipitation range. In fact, for each scenario, catchment responses are most similar for low precipitation events, with a divergence of the trend line away from the one-to-one regression, tending to occur only for higher precipitation events. Taken together, these preliminary results provide some ideas about the dynamics of these two catchments, and particularly how they relate to each other across different seasons and different antecedent conditions. As expected, seasonality and antecedent conditions are both strong controls on the event scale responses, irregardless of event character. Most notably, these controls are consistent between the catchments, leading to very similar intercatchment responses within each season, although summer did tend to yield the greatest discord. It's most likely that differences in the inherent layout of the catchments, particularly in terms of wetland position, are having more of an influence on these differences as opposed to lingering harvest-induced changes. This brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you for your time. Before I take any questions, I'd just like to take a moment to thank Jason Leach and Danielle Hudson at NRCan for providing the high-frequency data set, as well as Forwater and NSERC for funding this research. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Great talk.
I apologize for the coughing. I'm getting over a bit of a cold.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. Yeah, if anyone has questions, you can chime in or type in. I can also read your question. We have 2 minutes for A2 questions.
Maybe I'll get us kicked off on a question, Annie. First of all, great job powering through there. That's never fun to happen at that sort of thing, but yeah, go get yourself a giant glass of water after. But so from your results, it really seems like 25 years after harvesting, there's not too much of a difference between the two catchments in terms of this sort of event response stuff. Going into this analysis, is that what you expected, or did you expect something else, or what were your sort of if you could just sort of kind of provide some sort of expectations, and what were those expectations based on? That would be great to hear. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. So going into this, my sense based on some reading from other sites and my limited understanding of the catchments of Turkey Lakes was that there probably wouldn't be much of a difference now. It's been about 10 years since the hydrologic responses in these catchments were really contrasted or quantified in terms of those those flow paths. So I knew that there would likely be not much of a difference. And if there was, it would probably be more related to the inherent differences. That said, going into it, I thought that if there were going to be any substantial differences in the behavior of these catchments, it would likely occur under wet antecedent conditions, because that's when I figured the changes in the flow paths would be most likely to come into play. So that's what I expected. Kind of not really surprised to see seasonal controls overruling anything else. Certainly the flow is very seasonally driven at these catchments, and I saw that for myself when I was up there doing some sampling. So it's pretty much in line with what I expected. I kind of hope to see something maybe a little bit more interesting in terms of the lingering effect, but that just doesn't seem to be the case so far.
Yeah, thank you very much. We're up to the time here. There's one question in the chat. If you like, maybe type it in. I just gotta move on with our schedule.
Of course.
To our last, sorry about that. With our last speaker. And before we even go on, I just want to remind everyone that we still have part 2 of our session, Advanced Force Hydrology, that will happen after this talk and after a 20-minute break. So please, would like to welcome Mohammed Farstepour. If you would like to share your screen.
Okay, well, okay, you guys can see my screen, right?
Yes.
Yeah, very good. So, yeah, let me start. Hi, everyone. My name is Mohammed Farstepour, and I'm postdoctoral associate at the University of Western. And today I'll be talking about the influence of anthropogenic climate change, impacts of land cover change, and more importantly, the internal climate variability and the hydrology of Bachawana forested watershed. So let's get started. Effective water resources management, we all know that requires an understanding of the internal variability of watershed process and changes in the hydrological factors associated with indirect or direct influence of human activities. Overall increases in temperature, snowpack decline, and reduction in summer runoff, and more intense extreme precipitation events are expected in the future. And besides that, large uncertainties with climate model structure and internal climate variability can hamper the development of effective management strategies. Besides that, changes in land use and land cover can further complicate the hydrological responses. This would be highlighted in forested watershed, in which vegetation plays a major role and is a major factor. So we need to understand the individual and combined impacts of climate and land cover change. This helps us develop effective adaptation strategies. So the objective of this study is to assess the individual and combined influence of climate and land cover change and maximum snow water equivalent. We call it SWE, maximum and average stream flow in the forested watershed. And the second one is the quantifying the role of external forcing and unforced internal variability in the projections and characterizing the responding uncertainties. And as the main data for this assessment, we used 8 statistically downscaled GSMs and 3 large ensembles RCMs under RCP 8.5, business as usual, actually, emission scenario, under 6 warming levels above pre-industrial level. And as the main tool, the analyses are conducted using robust and flexible hydrological modeling framework called RAVEN, which is developed by Professor Craig and their research team at the University of Waterloo. So as mentioned, the case study is the Bachawana watershed in central Ontario, Canada. It is assumed to be a large watershed because of its large area, more than 1,000 square kilometers, that is mainly covered by dense forest and encompasses numerous lakes. It has 4 major land cover classes: water lakes, mixed forest, and deciduous and coniferous trees. And so for the climate data as an important input, we used a statistical downscale CMIP 5 GCMs provided by the Pacific Climate Impact Consortium to have future projections of temperature in precipitation as the main drivers for the stream flow estimation. And this data is available from 1950 to 2100 with a spatial resolution of roughly about 10 kilometers. And also we use large ensembles, RCM large ensembles. Few studies have been undertaken on the hydrology of forested watersheds and the impact of climate change. And these studies hardly ever use RCM large ensemble, and as a result, they couldn't take into account internal climate variability. So to facilitate quantifying the uncertainties associated with internal climate variability, we use 3 large ensembles. As you can see here, CM4, CANLEAD E, and CANLEAD S, which is the bias-corrected version of CM4. So as the main part of the methodology, the Raven hydrological modeling framework is set up and calibrated from 1980 to 2011. Then the GCMR simulations are then fed into the calibrated model to assess the role of forced anthropogenic signals and unforced climate variability. And then we consider 2 important land cover change scenario, actually as a possible trajectories. The first one is the CTM as a scenario in which coniferous tree cover are replaced by mixed forest. A mixed forest is assumed to include both deciduous and coniferous tree types in an equal proportion. And the second one is the CTD as the entire coniferous region if replaced with deciduous trees. So to calculate the ICV, the last part of this research, we employed the standard deviation of the corresponding values across all members of the large ensembles that we use in this study as a representative for internal climate variability. The anthropogenic climate change, which is called here ACC, is also defined as the mean of the multi-model ensemble using 8 GCMs single member model, and the first member of each of these 3 large ensembles are RCMs that we use. And finally, we use an important ratio called signal to noise to see how important and dominant external forcings are compared to the internal climate variability. Well, let's move on to the results. As you can see here, considering individual impacts of land cover change, you can see that during spring, the hydrologic response of the watershed differs slightly different between the land cover scenarios. The baseline has higher stream flow in the early spring, but as we get closer to the May, the stream flow for the CTM and CTD scenario becomes larger than the base condition, which makes sense actually, given the timing of the event and the higher snowpack they had in March. And as you can see here, it shows the higher snowpack of these 2 scenarios. So what's the reason behind it? But the difference is not much significant. What's the reason behind this insignificant changes between these scenarios? We can say that even though the deciduous forest ecosystems have higher snowpack, the soil's infiltration capacity and evaporation from the soil is also higher, resulting in a small difference between land cover change scenarios. But on the other hand, the difference in LII, which is leaf area index, is between this deciduous and coniferous forest types could be the only key difference at that time. I mean, before leaf out. After leaf out, those LAI values would be similar, and their hydrologic influence would be similar as well, and leading to the similarity in the stream flow. However, it is worth mentioning that our empirical understanding of how soil conditions and properties might change with change in forest cover is really limited. Soil development occurs over long periods, so that's something hard to nail down and could be a possible area for further exploration. So, right, what's the impact of climate change? Precipitation is projected to increase over time with an increase in global mean temperature over the coming decades, but the trend is not as substantial as it will be for temperature. Above average, something that is really important here is a snow drought, which is we define here as the above average temperatures and precipitation that are most common triggers of a snow drought. The temperature-driven decrease in snowpack cannot be offset by an increase in the precipitation when snow drought occurs during an above normal precipitation period. So all three large ensembles here, you can see that consistently project a strong warming and wetting trend for the Bechuana watershed. And the box plots are clearly showing how precipitation varies in different ensembles, indicating the existence of climate variability. And the uncertainty of large ensembles in the projection of precipitation is much higher than that of the temperature with highest uncertainty, as you can see for the GMTC of 4 degrees Celsius. Well, in line with precipitation and temperature, we can see higher stream flow in the far future, and this pattern, as you can see, turns the snow-dominated forest into a rain-dominated watershed. It therefore leads to reduced spring runoff peak, except for Canada CM4, as you can see in this figure. All projections are indicating a decreasing trend for annual max flow. The second picture, as expected, the annual max SWE indicates a smooth decreasing trend as temperature increases. This may be due to lower snowfall or increased loss through sublimation or melting. There is some differences also between different climate data and projections. As you can see here, Canalid S, which is one of the Canalid docs, which is bias-corrected version of Canalid CM4, projects a higher mean flow compared to Canalid E and Canalid CM4, and the projected stream flow by Canalid is approximately, as you can see, conforms to the mean of GCM simulations and reaches the same value by the end of the century. And from the comparison provided for the historical observation that I haven't actually bring that figure here in my presentation, we can say that Canalid CM4 have a large bias, in the Bechuana watershed for estimation of, hydrological variables and their projections. Let's see what happens when the combined effects of land cover and climate change are considered. Results are shown here based on the Canalid E, which could better capture the variation of mean and of the multinodals, GCMs, for stream flow and SWE. For the mean flow, the box number 1, as you can see, by shifting the land cover from baseline to TM and CTD, the stream flow reduces as we get closer to higher warming levels. And for the max flow, box number 2, CTM scenario, you can see that, which combines two important characteristics of the coniferous ecosystem as lower drainage and deciduous forest as higher snowpack, produces a relatively higher max flow you can see here. In addition, you can see that different land covers do not considerably influence the values of max flow and its uncertainty. And for the max SWE, shifting coniferous vegetation to mix and deciduous forests slightly increased the snowpack amount in the Bechuana forest watershed, and overall the interquartile range remains constant when considering different land cover scenario. All right. What matters most when considering future projections is to separate dominant factors. Here we use SNR, signal to noise ratio, to see how important internal climate variability is compared to the anthropogenic factors. For the mean flow, the first figure, the left, we can see that for the mean flow, the ratio of ACC to ICV is greater than 9, suggesting that in determining the future stream flow, the role of ICV becomes less noticeable over time. And the anthropogenic factors with an increasing trend are influential and dominant. It is worth mentioning that as the ACC has pure increasing trend for the mean flow, all fluctuations you can see here is mostly related to ICV. For the max flow, ACC also plays an important role, the main role. However, the SNR variation interval is less than that of the mean flow, indicating that the internal variability affects the annual max flow more than the mean flow. And the third one for the max SUID, the role of internal climate variability becomes noticeable over time, even though ACC governs the future change of max SUI until the late 21st century. Well, this brings me to the end of my presentation. Let me now summarize what I talked about. The major objectives of this study is to assess the effects of potential land cover and climate change and long-term hydrology of the Batcha-1 watershed. So we utilized climate data under 6 warming levels, considering land cover changes, stream flow doesn't change noticeably in summer, fall, and winter. However, possible domination of deciduous forest leads to a higher snowpack and thus contributes to greater stream flow toward the late spring. When it comes to climate change, the annual mean stream flow is projected to increase, and the peak flow is, on the other hand, is projected to decrease. And using RCM SMILE, single model initial condition large ensembles that we used, 3 of them with 50 members, we found that the internal variability plays a more pronounced role in the annual max flow compared to the mean flow. Even though ACC governs the future change of max SUI until the late 21st century, in the future projection of max SUI, the role of internal climate variability becomes noticeable. And when considering combined effects of land cover and climate change, we found that land cover change scenarios marginally influence the contribution of ACC and ICV in future stream flow and SUI projection, and that the climate variability has a much greater influence than forest land cover conversion. And as a final point, I'd like to acknowledge that funding of this research is provided by NSERC Discovery Grant. Also, I would like to acknowledge NRCan Great Lakes Forestry Center for sharing the information about this study area. Thank you, everybody, very much for your attention, and I'll be happy to answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Yeah, thanks for your talk. Yeah, we're eating a little bit of our break here, but we can, if anyone has any questions, please, you can unmute yourself or type it in. And I just want to remind you that we have part 2, that will be 20 minutes break here. So at 5:55 Central Time, and it will be in another Zoom link. Please go to the schedule and find part 2. But yeah, if anyone has any question, I will open the floor. And well, another way too is you can also leave this Zoom link open. I think I don't know if it will be okay, but yeah, someone want to ask further questions. And Mohammed, thank you very much. I think it's just, yeah, the break time, and people might be running to get some water and stretch the legs. And we'll be back with part 2. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you for all the speakers. And thank you for our invited speakers.